Welcome back to the Wilderness Protocol. The job listing said custodial assistant specialized collections, €22 an hour, which was more than I made at the hotel. I figured it meant dusting old books or mopping marble floors. I was completely right about the mopping part. My name is Jake Thompson, and I lasted exactly 47 days in the most peculiar job of my life. When people ask me why I quit, I tell them the pay wasn't worth it. When they ask what I actually did there, I change the subject. But you're here listening to this recording because you want the real story. And I'm finally ready to tell it. The Vatican has many rooms that tourists never see. Sub-levels that don't appear on any map. Storage areas that require special clearance and sign documents in 3 languages. I got hired because I spoke decent Italian, had a clean background check, and most importantly, I desperately needed the money. Dr. Williams interviewed me in a cramped office that smelled like old paper and bleach. He was a thin American priest who looked like he hadn't slept in months. His handshake felt like holding a bundle of cold twigs. The position involves maintenance of sensitive religious artifacts. He explained, not looking directly at me. Items that require careful handling and absolute discretion. I nodded. €22 an hour bought a lot of discretion. There are 5 simple rules. Dr. Williams continued, sliding a laminated card across his desk. Memorize them. Follow them exactly. No exceptions. Rule 1. Never enter room 77 alone. Always work in pairs. Rule 2. Clean only during daylight hours. 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Rule 3. If an item moves, leave it where it settles. Do not return it. Rule 4. Speak only English or Italian while inside. No other languages. Rule 5. Report everything unusual immediately to Dr. Williams. Simple enough, I said, pocketing the card. Dr. Williams finally looked at me directly. Simple and absolutely vital. Break any rule and you're terminated immediately. Follow them and this job will fund your studies quite comfortably. I started the next Monday. My partner was Kevin Murphy, a college dropout from Boston who'd been working Vatican maintenance for 2 years. Kevin had the permanent squint of someone who'd seen things he preferred not to discuss. Rule number 1 is the most important. Kevin told me as we rode the service elevator down to sub 3. Never ever go in there alone. I don't care if you drop your keys or need to grab something quick. Always wait for backup. The elevator doors opened to reveal a long corridor lined with heavy wooden doors. Each door bore a brass number and multiple locks. Room 77 sat at the very end, painted the same cream color as all the others, but somehow looking different. Maybe it was the extra locks or the small red light mounted above the frame. What's actually in there? I asked. Kevin handed me a bucket and mop. Things that didn't work out the way they were supposed to. Room 77 measured exactly 30 feet by 20 feet. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, each labeled with dates, locations, and case numbers. The items themselves defied easy description. On the first shelf sat what looked like a ceramic bowl, except it was turned completely inside out. Not broken and reassembled, but actually inverted, as if someone had reached inside and flipped it like a sock. The tag read Milan 1987. Subject attempted self-exorcism. Next to it was a wooden crucifix that appeared to be melting upward. The wood dripped toward the ceiling in frozen drops suspended in midair. Rome 1994. Exorcism interrupted at critical moment. A child's teddy bear sat in a clear plastic container. It looked normal except for the fact that its fur grew inward instead of outward, creating a surface that seemed to absorb light. Naples, 2003. Possession transferred to comfort object. First rule of cleaning in here, Kevin said, pulling on rubber gloves. Don't stare at anything too long. Second rule, if something falls or moves, leave it exactly where it lands. Third rule, work fast. I learned that the Vatican's exorcism success rate wasn't as high as people assumed. For every successful casting out of demons, there were failures, partial exorcisms that left subjects changed, interrupted rituals that transferred problems rather than solving them, botched procedures that created entirely new issues. Room 77 housed the physical evidence of these failures. Why keep them? I asked Kevin during our first lunch break. Research, he said simply. Dr. Williams and his team study them, looking for patterns, trying to understand what went wrong, hoping to do better next time. The work itself was straightforward. We mopped the floors, dusted the shelves, and emptied the small trash bins. The items themselves required no cleaning. They seemed to repel dust and grime naturally. We weren't allowed to touch them directly, only clean around them. Most days passed without incident. Kevin and I developed a routine. Arrive at 9 sharp, prop the door open, turn on all the lights, and work methodically from left to right. We'd finish by 3:30 and spend the remaining time organizing supplies or helping with other maintenance tasks throughout the Vatican. The items didn't bother me initially. They were strange, certainly, but they felt more like museum pieces than active threats. A clock that ran backward, a mirror that reflected rooms from different buildings, a photograph that showed different people depending on the viewing angle. Curious rather than frightening. That changed during my 3rd week. Kevin called in sick on a Tuesday morning. I waited in the break room until 9:15, then called Dr. Williams to report. I'm sending Tommy down as your partner for today, he said. He'll meet you at room 77 in 10 minutes. Tommy Rodriguez turned out to be a maintenance supervisor I'd seen around but never worked with directly. He seemed competent enough, though he kept checking his watch and muttering about other responsibilities. We entered room 77 together and began our usual routine. Tommy took the left side while I handled the right. Everything proceeded normally until about 10:30 when I heard him swear loudly. What happened? I called over. Knocked over that stupid bowl thing. Tommy said. The inside-out one. I looked over to see the ceramic bowl rolling across the floor. It came to rest near the center of the room, settling with a soft clink. Leave it, I said, remembering Kevin's instructions. It's just a bowl. Tommy replied, walking toward it. I'll put it back. No, I said firmly. Rule 3. Leave it where it settles. Tommy paused, his hand halfway extended. That's the dumbest rule I've ever heard. It's just going to be in the way. But he didn't pick it up. Instead, he stepped around it and continued working. I made a mental note to tell Dr. Williams about the incident when we finished. The bowl stayed where it had fallen for the rest of the morning. Every few minutes, I'd glance at it, sitting there in the middle of the walkway. It looked completely harmless. Just a ceramic bowl, albeit one that had been turned inside out through means I didn't understand. At 11:45, I went to empty the trash bin near the door. When I turned around, Tommy was gone. Not gone from the room. Gone entirely. His mop bucket sat exactly where he'd been standing, still sudsy with cleaning solution. His jacket hung on the door hook. But Tommy himself had simply vanished. I called his name. No response. I checked behind the shelving units, thinking maybe he dropped something and crawled back to retrieve it. Nothing. The bowl still sat in the center of the room, looking exactly as it had before. I followed Rule 5 immediately. Dr. Williams arrived within minutes, accompanied by 2 other priests I didn't recognize. They examined the room carefully, taking notes and photographs. One of them made several phone calls in rapid Italian. Where exactly was Tommy when you last saw him? Dr. Williams asked. I pointed to the spot near the inverted bowl. Right there he was mopping. I went to empty the trash, and when I turned around, he was gone. Dr. Williams knelt beside the bowl, studying it closely without touching. How long between when you looked away and looked back? Maybe 30 seconds. A minute at most. The three priests exchanged meaningful glances. One of them produced a long pair of metal tongs from a leather case and carefully lifted the bowl back to its original position on the shelf. Tommy Rodriguez never worked for Vatican maintenance. Dr. Williams told me quietly, we have no employee by that name. The official story was that I'd been working alone and had gotten confused due to the stress of the job. Tommy Rodriguez didn't exist in any Vatican personnel records. No one had assigned him to work with me. The security cameras showed me entering room 77 alone and leaving alone. But I remembered Tommy clearly. His complaints about the rules. His insistence that the bowl was harmless. The way he'd vanished between one moment and the next. Kevin returned to work the following day. Completely healthy. When I asked about his sick day, he looked confused. I wasn't sick, he said. Yesterday was my day off. Don't you remember? I told you last week I had a dentist appointment. I checked the schedule. Kevin was right. Tuesday had been marked as his day off for weeks. That evening, I sat in my small apartment and tried to make sense of what had happened. I'd worked with someone who didn't exist during a shift that was never supposed to happen. Cleaning around objects that defied explanation. The laminated rule card sat on my kitchen table. I read it again carefully, paying attention to the exact wording. Rule 1. Never enter room 77 alone. Always work in pairs. I had followed this rule. Tommy had been there with me. Rule 2. Clean only during daylight hours. 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. We'd been working during normal hours. Rule 3. If an item moves, leave it where it settles. Do not return it. I had followed this rule. Tommy had wanted to move the bowl, but hadn't actually done it. Rule 4. Speak only English or Italian while inside. No other languages. We'd spoken only English. Rule 5. Report everything unusual immediately to Dr. Williams. I had called him as soon as Tommy disappeared. I'd followed every rule perfectly. Yet something had gone terribly wrong. The next morning, I asked Kevin about the inverted bowl specifically. Milan, 1987. He recited from memory. Guy tried to perform an exorcism on himself. Used a mirror and some kind of reflection technique he'd read about online. The idea was to turn the demon inside out instead of casting it out. Did it work? Kevin shook his head partially. The demon got inverted. But it didn't leave. Instead, it became something else. Something that could create false people. False situations. The bowl is what's left of the mirror he used. I stared at the bowl sitting innocently on its shelf. So, Tommy wasn't real. Tommy was real while he was here. Kevin said carefully. The bowl creates temporary people to help break the rules. Usually, someone who will insist on moving it or picking it up. If you'd let him touch it, the effect would have been permanent. What would have happened then? Kevin was quiet for a long moment. You would have disappeared instead. And Tommy would have finished the shift and gone home, never knowing he hadn't existed until that morning. I worked in room 77 for 3 more weeks after that. Kevin taught me about the other items and their histories. The backward clock came from a priest who tried to reverse time during a failed exorcism. The photograph that changed subjects was created when someone attempted to trap a demon inside a picture frame. The melting crucifix resulted from an exorcism that had been performed too quickly. causing the holy symbol to partially enter another dimension. Each item represented a failure, but also a lesson. The Vatican collected them not just for research, but as warnings. Reminders of what happened when people got careless or overconfident when dealing with forces they didn't fully understand. But knowing the history didn't make the job easier. Every day brought small incidents. Items would shift slightly when we weren't looking directly at them. The temperature would fluctuate without explanation. Sometimes I'd hear voices speaking languages that weren't quite Italian and weren't quite English. Something in between that made my teeth ache. Kevin handled it all with practiced calm. He'd been doing this job for 2 years and had developed a sort of professional detachment. He cleaned around objects that defied physics and chatted about football as if nothing unusual was happening. I tried to match his attitude, but the constant strangeness wore on me. I started having trouble sleeping. My appetite disappeared. I found myself checking and rechecking the rules card multiple times per day. The breaking point came during my 7th week on the job. We were cleaning as usual when Kevin stopped suddenly near a shelf containing what looked like an ordinary leather-bound book. Except this book was reading itself. The pages turned automatically every few seconds, and occasionally it would make small humming sounds. "That's new," Kevin said, frowning. The book hadn't been there the day before. I was certain of it. We cleaned every shelf thoroughly, and I'd memorized the location of every item. "Should we report it?" I asked. Kevin nodded, but before he could respond, the book snapped shut with a loud crack. The sound echoed off the walls, seeming to bounce back and forth long after it should have faded. Then every item in the room began to change. The inverted bowl started spinning slowly, making a low grinding sound like stone against stone. The melting crucifix began dripping faster, its wooden tears falling upward toward the ceiling before dissolving into smoke. The teddy bear with inward growing fur began to expand and contract rhythmically as if breathing. Kevin said quietly, "We need to get out right now." But as we turned toward the door, I saw that the red light above the frame was flashing rapidly. The door itself had somehow acquired 3 additional locks that definitely hadn't been there when we entered. Kevin pulled out his radio and called Dr. Williams. The response was immediate, but crackling with static. "The room is in containment mode," came the distorted voice. "Do not attempt to leave. Follow Emergency Protocol 7. "What's Emergency Protocol 7? I asked. Kevin's face had gone completely pale. "Stand perfectly still until it stops." The changes accelerated. A music box that had been silent for decades began playing a tiny waltz. A wooden puppet started moving its arms and legs in jerky motions. A snow globe filled with what looked like blood instead of water began swirling violently. The book that had started it all opened again and began flipping through its pages at incredible speed. I caught glimpses of text in various languages, diagrams that hurt to look at directly, and photographs that seemed to move when I wasn't focusing on them. "How long does this usually last?" I whispered. "This has never happened before." Kevin replied through gritted teeth. Something was building in the room. Not sound exactly, but a pressure that made my ears pop. The fluorescent lights began flickering in a rapid pattern that almost looked like Morse code. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly cold air. The items weren't just changing. They were communicating with each other. The inverted bowls spinning synchronized with the puppet's movements. The music box's waltz matched the rhythm of the teddy bear's breathing. The blood in the snow globe swirled in time with the book's page turning. Everything in the room was operating as part of some larger system. "It's like they're waking up," I said. Kevin nodded grimly. "The Vatican keeps them separated for a reason. They're not supposed to interact." The red light above the door stopped flashing and turned solid red. A moment later, the intercom crackled to life. "Emergency Protocol 7 is now in effect. Dr. Williams announced. Remain stationary. Do not touch anything. Do not speak to each other. Wait for further instructions. We stood frozen in the middle of the room while the failed exorcism artifacts continued their bizarre symphony around us. Minutes passed. The activity seemed to reach a peak, then gradually began to slow down. The music box wound down to silence. The puppet's movements became less frequent. The book's pages stopped turning quite so rapidly. One by one, the items returned to their previous states. But they weren't exactly the same as before. The inverted bowl now sat at a slightly different angle. The melting crucifix had acquired new drip patterns frozen in midair. The teddy bear's fur seemed to absorb even more light than before. Small changes, but unmistakable to someone who'd been cleaning around these objects for weeks. The red light finally turned green, and we heard the electronic locks disengaging. You may now exit. Dr. Williams announced over the intercom. Report to my office immediately. We grabbed our cleaning supplies and left room 77 as quickly as possible. The door sealed behind us with a heavy thunk that seemed more final than usual. Dr. Williams was waiting in his office with 2 other priests and a woman in a lab coat I'd never seen before. They asked detailed questions about everything we'd observed, taking notes and occasionally conferring in whispered Latin. Has anything like this happened before? I asked when they finished their interrogation. Not at this scale. Dr. Williams admitted. Individual items have shown increased activity, but never synchronized behavior across the entire collection. The woman in the lab coat looked up from her notes. We believe the new acquisition may have acted as a catalyst. The book appears to have some form of connective properties we weren't aware of. What kind of book is it? Kevin asked. A failed attempt to create a comprehensive guide to exorcism procedures. She explained. The author tried to bind information from multiple sources, including some that were less than cooperative. The book became self-aware during the binding process. Dr. Williams leaned back in his chair. We're implementing new safety protocols immediately. Room 77 will be sealed for evaluation. You'll both be reassigned to other duties until further notice. That was fine with me. I'd had enough of cleaning around objects that defied natural law. But as we prepared to leave his office, Dr. Williams stopped me with a final question. Jake, during the incident, did you notice anything else unusual? Anything beyond what you've already reported? I thought about it carefully. The items weren't just active. They were organized, like they were working together towards some specific goal. What kind of goal? I considered my words carefully. It felt like they were trying to establish a permanent connection. Not just temporary activation, but something lasting. Dr. Williams and the woman in the lab coat exchanged a meaningful look. Thank you, he said finally. That's very helpful information. Kevin and I were reassigned to general maintenance duties throughout the Vatican. We cleaned chapels, polished marble floors, and maintained the gardens. Normal work with normal cleaning supplies around normal objects that stayed exactly where we put them. But I couldn't stop thinking about room 77. About the items working together. About the new book that had somehow catalyzed their synchronized behavior. About what might happen next. 3 weeks later, Kevin didn't show up for work. According to personnel records, Kevin Murphy had never been employed by the Vatican. No such person existed in their system. His keycard didn't work. His uniform was missing from his locker. The other maintenance staff looked at me blankly when I asked about him. But I remembered Kevin clearly. 2 years of experience cleaning room 77. His warnings about the rules. His professional detachment in the face of the impossible. His detailed knowledge of every item's history and origin. I sat in the break room during lunch trying to make sense of it. First Tommy Rodriguez, who had never existed, Now Kevin Murphy, who had existed until suddenly he didn't. The only constant was me, and room 77. That evening, I made a decision. I was going to quit this job, leave Rome, and never look back. Whatever was happening in that room was beyond my understanding or ability to handle safely. I typed up my resignation letter, planning to submit it first thing in the morning. But when I woke up, I couldn't remember Kevin Murphy's name. I knew I'd had a partner, someone who taught me about the artifacts and their histories, but the details were fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream. By the time I arrived at work, I couldn't remember having a partner at all. Dr. Williams called me into his office and explained that I'd been selected for a promotion. Advanced custodial duties with increased responsibilities and higher pay. €30 an hour. You'll be working alone now, he said, sliding a familiar laminated card across his desk. The rules have been updated for single-person operations. I looked at the card. 5 simple rules exactly as before, but slightly different. Rule 1. Enter room 77 only during assigned shifts. Never deviate from schedule. Rule 2. Clean only during daylight hours. 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Rule 3. If an item moves, leave it where it settles. Do not return it. Rule 4. Speak only English or Italian while inside. No other languages. Rule 5. Report everything unusual immediately to Dr. Williams. Wait, I said. Rule 1 used to say, never enter alone. Always work in pairs. Dr. Williams looked confused. You've always worked alone, Jake, since your first day. I stared at the rule card, trying to remember. Had I always worked alone? It seemed like I should remember having a partner, but the memory wouldn't come into focus. Is there a problem? Dr. Williams asked. I looked at the card again. The rules seemed perfectly reasonable, simple, and straightforward. No, I said. No problem at all. But as I walked toward the elevator that would take me down to sub 3, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been forgotten. Something about room 77 and the people who worked there. Something about the rules and why they existed in the first place. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside alone. Working alone in room 77 felt different from the first day. The silence was the most noticeable change. Without a partner to chat with, the room felt larger and more hollow. My footsteps echoed differently. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter. Even the artifacts themselves appeared more prominent, as if they'd moved closer to the walkways overnight. But I followed my routine exactly as I'd been trained. Arrive at 9 sharp. Prop the door open. Turn on all the lights. And work methodically from left to right. Mop the floors. Dust the shelves. Empty the small trash bins. Simple, straightforward maintenance work. The artifacts required no cleaning. They still repelled dust and grime naturally. I cleaned around them without incident, just as I'd always done. At least that's what I thought I'd always done. Sometimes I caught myself starting conversations with someone who wasn't there. I'd begin to say something like, "Hey, did you notice?" before realizing I was completely alone. These moments felt like trying to remember a song I'd only heard once years ago. Dr. Williams checked on me regularly during my first week of solo work. He'd appear in the doorway and observe me cleaning, taking notes on a small pad. He seemed satisfied with my performance. "Everything going smoothly, Jake?" he asked on Friday afternoon. "Yes, sir. No problems at all. Any unusual activity from the items?" I glanced around the room. The inverted bowl sat in its assigned spot. The melting crucifix hung motionless in its perpetual drip pattern. The teddy bear with inward fur remained perfectly still in its container. Nothing unusual, I reported. Dr. Williams made a note and left without further comment. That weekend, I tried to research the Vatican's exorcism procedures online. Most of what I found was either completely ridiculous or clearly fictional. The serious academic sources mentioned success rates and statistical analysis but provided no details about failures or what happened to the physical evidence afterward. I did find one interesting article in an obscure religious studies journal. It discussed the concept of spiritual residue. The idea that failed supernatural interventions could leave behind physical traces that retained some properties of the original phenomenon. According to the article, these traces were typically small and harmless. A cross that felt slightly warm to the touch. A Bible that opened to the same page every time. Minor anomalies that pose no real threat. But the article also mentioned that in rare cases, multiple traces could influence each other if stored together. Like radioactive materials reaching critical mass. Spiritual residue could theoretically accumulate enough energy to become active again. I thought about Room 77 and its dozens of failed exorcism artifacts. Each one a trace of something that had gone wrong. All of them stored together in a single location. Monday morning brought my second week of solo work. I followed my usual routine, but noticed that several items had shifted positions slightly over the weekend. Not dramatically, just a few inches here and there. The kind of movement that could easily be explained by building settling or temperature changes. Except the Vatican sublevels maintained constant temperature and humidity. And these particular items had remained in fixed positions for years before my solo assignment. I made a note to mention it to Dr. Williams during his next check-in. But when he visited on Tuesday, I found myself hesitating to bring it up. The movements were so minor, and he'd specifically asked about unusual activity. A few items shifting slightly didn't seem worth reporting. Everything normal? He asked as usual. Yes, sir. All normal. Wednesday brought more movement. The inverted bowl had rotated about 30 degrees. The melting crucifix now dripped at a slightly different angle. The teddy bear had turned to face the center of the room instead of the wall. Still minor changes. Still within the range of normal settling. But the pattern bothered me. I spent my lunch break reviewing the rules card. Rule 3 was clear. If an item moves, leave it where it settles. Do not return it. I was following that rule perfectly. I wasn't moving anything back to its original position. But the rule didn't say anything about reporting movement. That fell under Rule 5. Report everything unusual immediately to Dr. Williams. Was gradual shifting unusual, or was it normal behavior for artifacts that had been stored in the same location for years? I decided to wait and see if the movement continued. By Friday, the pattern was unmistakable. Every item in the room had shifted position. All of them turning to face inward toward the center of the room. They formed a rough circle around the spot where I did most of my cleaning work. This was definitely unusual enough to report. Dr. Williams listened to my description with intense focus, asking specific questions about timing and positioning. He took extensive notes and requested that I mark the current location of each item with small pieces of tape. Continue your normal routine, he instructed, but document any further movement carefully. Take photographs if possible. I spent the weekend thinking about the artifact's behavior. The gradual repositioning reminded me of flowers turning to face the sun. Or maybe iron filings aligning with a magnetic field. What if the artifacts weren't moving randomly? What if they were responding to some kind of influence? Monday morning answered that question definitively. All the items had moved again over the weekend. But this time, the positions were precisely planned. They formed a perfect geometric pattern. A complex arrangement that looked almost like a diagram or blueprint. At the center of the pattern, Directly where I always started my cleaning routine was a new item that definitely hadn't been there on Friday. It looked like a simple wooden box about the size of a shoe box with no markings or decorations. Just plain wood with what appeared to be a standard hinged lid. I stared at it for several minutes trying to decide what to do. This clearly fell under Rule 5. Report everything unusual immediately. But it also raised questions about Rule 3. Had this box moved here? Or had it simply appeared? I called Dr. Williams immediately. He arrived within 10 minutes. Accompanied by the same woman in the lab coat I'd met before. They examined the box without touching it, taking photographs from multiple angles and making detailed measurements of its position relative to the other artifacts. Has anyone else been in this room since Friday? Dr. Williams asked. No, sir. The door was locked when I arrived this morning. Same as always. The woman in the lab coat knelt beside the box and studied it closely. It's definitely the same wood as the self-reading book. Same grain pattern. Same staining. I think this box was part of the original binding process. Meaning what exactly? I asked. Dr. Williams stood up slowly. The book we acquired 3 weeks ago wasn't just a failed exorcism guide. It was an attempt to create physical storage for spiritual energy. The book was supposed to be the interface, but it needed a container to hold what it collected. I looked around the room at all the artifacts arranged in their careful pattern, and it's been collecting energy from all of these. That's our working theory. The woman replied. The book catalyzed the connection, but the box is what actually stores the accumulated power. What happens if it gets full? Dr. Williams and the lab coat woman exchanged one of their meaningful looks. We're not sure. He admitted. This is unprecedented territory. They spent the rest of the morning taking measurements and photographs. The box remained perfectly still throughout their investigation, looking completely harmless. Just a simple wooden container sitting on a clean floor. But I noticed that the other artifacts had continued moving while we worked. Tiny adjustments, barely perceptible, but constant, like they were fine-tuning their positions. I think they're still active, I said. Dr. Williams followed my gaze and saw what I meant. The inverted bowl had rotated another few degrees. The melting crucifix had shifted slightly to the left. The movements were small, but definitely deliberate. We need to evacuate this room immediately, he said. But as we turned toward the door, I saw that the red light above the frame was already flashing. The electronic locks had engaged automatically. Containment protocol is active, the woman announced, checking her radio. We're sealed in until the energy levels stabilize. How long does that usually take? I asked. We don't know, Dr. Williams admitted. This is the first time we've seen anything like this. The box in the center of the room began to vibrate slightly. Not violently, just a gentle trembling that was barely visible. But the sound it made was unmistakable. A low humming that seemed to resonate in my chest. All around us, the artifacts responded to the humming. The inverted bowl started spinning slowly. The melting crucifix began dripping faster. The teddy bear expanded and contracted rhythmically. Starting, the woman said quietly. Starting what? The collection process. 40 years of failed exorcisms. All the spiritual residue they left behind being gathered into a single container. The humming grew louder. I could feel it in my teeth now. A vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The box trembled faster, and I noticed that its lid was starting to open. Should we do something? I asked. Like what? Dr. Williams replied. We don't even know what we're dealing with. The lid continued opening slowly, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Not black paint or empty space, but actual darkness that seemed to absorb light from the fluorescent fixtures overhead. As the lid opened wider, the humming intensified. The artifacts around the room began moving faster. Their various activities synchronized to match the rhythm of whatever was happening inside the box. It's like a reverse exorcism, the woman said, speaking loudly to be heard over the humming. Instead of casting something out, just drawing everything in. Drawing what in exactly? All the failed attempts, all the partial successes, all the spiritual energy that was supposed to be eliminated but got trapped in these objects instead. The box lid reached its fully open position and locked into place with a sharp click. The darkness inside began to swirl, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Then, one by one, the artifacts began to change. The inverted bowl collapsed in on itself, becoming a point of impossible geometry before vanishing entirely. The melting crucifix liquefied completely, its wooden drops flowing across the floor toward the box and disappearing into the darkness. The teddy bear deflated like a punctured balloon, its inward growing fur flowing backward into its body until nothing remained but an empty plastic container. Each artifact contributed something to the box. Energy, substance, or properties I couldn't identify, but they all ended up in the same place, absorbed into the swirling darkness at the room's center. It's working, the woman said with something like awe in her voice. It's actually collecting everything. Is that good or bad? I asked. Depends on what happens when it's finished. Dr. Williams replied. We stood there watching as decades of failed exorcism artifacts fed themselves into the mysterious box. The process was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, like watching a complex machine disassemble itself in perfect order. The self-reading book was one of the last items to be absorbed. It fluttered its pages rapidly before flying across the room like a large bird, diving directly into the darkness and disappearing without a trace. When the last artifact vanished, the humming stopped abruptly. The silence felt louder than the noise had been. The box sat in the center of the empty room, its lid still open, the darkness inside now perfectly still. Is it over? I whispered, as if responding to my question. The darkness began to move again, but instead of swirling inward, it started flowing outward. A thin stream of absolute black began pouring from the box like water, spreading across the floor in all directions. That's not good, Dr. Williams said. The darkness moved with purpose, flowing toward the walls and pooling in the corners. Wherever it touched, the fluorescent lights dimmed noticeably. The temperature dropped several degrees in seconds. It's not just collecting, the woman realized. It's concentrating. 40 years of failed exorcisms compressed into pure spiritual energy. What does that mean? It means we've accidentally created the most powerful supernatural artifact in human history. The darkness reached the walls and began climbing upward, defying gravity as easily as water flows downhill. It covered the metal shelving units, the empty spaces where artifacts had been stored, and finally the ceiling itself. Within minutes, we were standing in a room lined entirely with flowing darkness. Only a small circle around our feet remained illuminated by the failing fluorescent lights. The containment system is failing, Dr. Williams announced, checking his radio. The locks are disengaging. That's good, right? We can get out. Not if this thing gets loose in the Vatican. But we didn't have a choice. The lights were failing rapidly, and the circle of illumination around us was shrinking by the second. We had maybe 2 minutes before we'd be standing in complete darkness with whatever had emerged from that box. We ran for the door as soon as the locks disengaged. The red light above the frame was flashing frantically, cycling through colors I'd never seen before. The corridor beyond looked normal, but I could hear alarms sounding throughout the building. Dr. Williams sealed the door behind us using an emergency override that required 2 different keys and a numeric code. Multiple locks engaged with heavy metallic sounds. Will that hold it? I asked. For a while. He said grimly. But we need a permanent solution. The Vatican's emergency response team worked through the night. I was debriefed extensively by priests, scientists, and officials whose job titles I didn't recognize. They asked detailed questions about everything I'd observed, taking notes and occasionally conferring in rapid Latin. By morning, they had developed a plan. We're going to reverse the process. Dr. Williams explained. Instead of allowing the box to concentrate all that spiritual energy, we're going to disperse it. How? Controlled explosion. Scatter the energy across a large enough area that it becomes harmless. And if that doesn't work, Dr. Williams was quiet for a moment. Then we evacuate this section of the Vatican and seal it permanently. The explosion was scheduled for noon, when the sun would be directly overhead and spiritual energy was theoretically at its weakest. I was moved to a safe location several buildings away, but I could still feel the shock wave when the charges detonated. The plan worked. Room 77 was completely destroyed along with the box and whatever had emerged from it. The spiritual energy was dispersed harmlessly into the atmosphere where it would dissipate naturally over time. Or at least that's what the official report said. I was compensated generously for my service and sworn to absolute secrecy. The Vatican offered me a transfer to any of their facilities worldwide with a significant promotion and pay increase. I declined. I'd had enough of cleaning up after things that shouldn't exist. But before I left Rome, I had one final meeting with Dr. Williams. What really happened in there? I asked. The full truth. He was quiet for a long time, staring out his office window at the city beyond. 40 years of failed exorcisms. He said finally, 40 years of partial successes, interrupted rituals, and botched procedures. All that spiritual energy had to go somewhere, and it went into the artifacts. Some of it, but not all. He turned to look at me directly. The rest went into the people who worked with those artifacts. Day after day, year after year, cleaning around objects that retain traces of supernatural influence. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. People like me, people like all of us, the maintenance staff, the researchers, the priests who oversaw the collection. We were all exposed to residual spiritual energy for extended periods. What does that mean? Dr. Williams pulled out a file folder and placed it on his desk. Kevin Murphy worked with those artifacts for 2 years. Tommy Rodriguez supposedly never existed, but his fingerprints are on half the cleaning equipment. Both of them were exposed to the same energies you were, and they disappeared. They were absorbed. The box didn't just collect energy from the artifacts. It collected energy from anyone who'd been contaminated by long-term exposure. I stared at the file folder, not wanting to open it, but knowing I had to. How contaminated am I? I asked. The tests are inconclusive. You were exposed for 47 days, which is significant, but not extreme. The explosion may have dispersed enough energy to reduce your contamination to safe levels. May have. We'll need to monitor you regularly. Monthly blood tests, psychological evaluations, and regular check-ins with our medical staff. I opened the file folder. Inside were test results, medical charts, and photographs of various Vatican maintenance staff from the past 5 years. Many of the faces were crossed out in red ink. How many people have disappeared? I asked. 17. Over the past decade. All of them worked with the artifacts for extended periods. All of them showed similar contamination patterns. And you didn't think to warn me about this. Dr. Williams sighed heavily. We thought the new safety protocols would prevent further contamination. The partner system, the limited exposure times, the regular rotations. We believed we had the situation under control until the box appeared. Until the box appeared. He agreed. That changed everything. It actively sought out contaminated individuals to complete its collection process. I closed the file and stood up. So, what happens now? Now, you go home, live your life, and report any unusual experiences immediately. The contamination may fade naturally over time. Most people exposed to spiritual residue show no long-term effects. And if I'm not most people, Dr. Williams didn't answer that question directly. Instead, he handed me a business card with only a phone number printed on it. Call this number if anything strange happens. Day or night, someone will answer. I left Rome that afternoon and returned to my hometown in Ohio. I got a job doing normal maintenance work at a normal office building. Cleaning normal floors with normal equipment around normal objects that stayed exactly where I put them. For 6 months, everything was fine. The monthly blood tests showed declining contamination levels. The psychological evaluations indicated no lasting effects from my Vatican experience. I started to believe that I was going to be one of the lucky ones. Then one Tuesday morning, I woke up and couldn't remember my own name. I knew I was someone. I had memories of a life, a job, an apartment, but the specific details were fuzzy, like trying to remember a movie I'd seen years ago. I looked at my driver's license and saw Jake Thompson, but the name felt foreign. By evening, the memories had returned, but the incident scared me enough to call the number Dr. Williams had given me. These episodes are not uncommon. The voice on the phone explained. Spiritual contamination can cause temporary memory disruption as the residual energy dissipates. How long will this continue? Hard to say. Could be weeks. Could be months. But the episodes should become less frequent over time. They were right about the frequency. The memory lapses occurred every few weeks at first, then monthly, then every few months. But they never fully stopped. And each time they happened, I lost a little more of myself. Not just memories, but personality traits, preferences, habits. I'd wake up liking different foods, listening to different music, having different opinions about movies I'd seen the week before. It was like being slowly erased and rewritten. The Vatican doctors assured me this was normal. Spiritual contamination often caused identity fluctuations during the recovery process. My core personality would eventually stabilize. They said the episodes would fade completely. But after 2 years of monthly check-ins and quarterly evaluations, I started to suspect they were lying. The truth became clear during my final appointment with Dr. Williams. He was older, grayer, and looked like he hadn't slept well in months. Jake, he said carefully, I need to ask you some questions about your time in room 77. I've answered those questions dozens of times. I know, but your answers have been changing. He pulled out a thick file folder and opened it to reveal transcripts of my previous interviews. Page after page of testimony with subtle differences highlighted in yellow. In your first interview, you said Kevin Murphy worked with you for 3 weeks. In your 6-month follow-up, you said it was 2 weeks. Last month, you said you'd never had a partner named Kevin. I stared at the transcripts, trying to reconcile the conflicting information. I remember Kevin clearly. He taught me about the artifacts. Which artifacts specifically? I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. The details were hazy, like trying to remember a dream. I could picture Kevin's face, but not the conversations we'd had. I remembered working together, but not what we'd actually done. The contamination isn't fading. Dr. Williams said gently, it's changing you slowly, gradually, but consistently. Changing me into what? We're not sure. But we think the spiritual energy is replacing your original personality with something else. something that was never fully formed when the collection process was interrupted. I left that appointment with more questions than answers. But over the following months, I started to understand what was happening to me. I wasn't Jake Thompson anymore. I wasn't sure I ever really had been. I was something the box had tried to create when it absorbed all those failed exorcisms. An artificial person constructed from spiritual residue and implanted memories. The explosion had interrupted the process before I could be completed, leaving me partially formed and unstable. The real Jake Thompson had probably disappeared months ago, just like Kevin Murphy and Tommy Rodriguez. I was what was left behind, a spiritual echo trying to maintain the illusion of being human. The memory lapses weren't symptoms of recovery. They were me losing cohesion, slowly dissolving back into the energy I'd been constructed from. But I fought it. Every day, I wrote down everything I could remember about my life, my experiences, my thoughts, and feelings. I created external memory systems to compensate for the internal ones that were failing. I recorded this story because I wanted there to be some record of what happened in Room 77. Not the official version with its sanitized reports and clinical language, but the human experience of living through something impossible. Because that's what I was ultimately, a human experience. Maybe not originally human, maybe not entirely real, but human in all the ways that mattered. I don't know how much longer I can maintain this coherence. The episodes are getting more frequent again, and each time I lose more of myself. But for now, in this moment, I am Jake Thompson. I cleaned the room where the Vatican stores exorcist failures, and I survived long enough to tell you about it. The recording ends there. Make of it what you will. Thank you for listening to this entry from the Wilderness Protocol. If you made it through this report and wish to be briefed on future incidents, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel.